Yo, what's going on guys? Welcome back. Are you stuck between choosing a Crested Gecko or a Leopard Gecko? Well, you're not the only one. Both the Crested Gecko and the Leopard Gecko are both really popular pet reptiles for beginners. But despite both of them being cute, easy to care for, and a manageable size, they do have their differences. And in today's video, I would like to talk a bit about this so you can understand what the main differences are between the Crested Gecko and the Leopard Gecko. So we're going to break down the main differences between the two species. Hopefully by the end of this video, you will be able to narrow down on which gecko would suit you more. And hopefully you'll have a better idea on which gecko to go for. So let's begin the video. So to start with, let's just discuss about where they actually come from. So they both come from two different regions. The Crested Gecko, like this beautiful gecko here, comes from a place called New Caledonia, which is a tropical island just off of Australia. Whereas the Leopard Gecko comes from places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, India and surrounding areas. So straight away, because they're both from two completely different regions, therefore they both experience two different kinds of climates. For example, the Leopard Gecko coming from places like Pakistan is going to be a lot more drier of an environment. And then the Crested Gecko coming from New Caledonia is a more tropical environment. So straight away, this is one huge difference between the two different geckos. But we'll touch more on this shortly. So the main difference between both the Leopard Gecko and the Crested Gecko is obviously their temperature and humidity requirements. Now, Crested Geckos prefer lower temperature environments. So for their temperature, they mainly need a temperature range of around 22 to 28 degrees Celsius, which is 72 to 82 Fahrenheit. And their humidity is going to be a lot higher than a Leopard Gecko because Crested Geckos are from a tropical environment. So for their humidity range, they need roughly between 50 to 80% humidity. Now, Leopard Geckos come from a hotter and drier environment compared to the Crested Gecko, thus meaning that their temperature range is going to be slightly higher than a Crested Gecko. So for the Leopard Geckos, you're going to want to provide a temperature range of around 26 to 32 degrees Celsius, which is 78 to 92 Fahrenheit, but they can also adapt to hotter temperatures up to around 35 degrees Celsius. Now, regarding Leopard Gecko humidity, obviously we've already established that they're from a drier environment. This means that their humidity is going to be a lot lower than a Crested Gecko. So for Leopard Gecko humidity range, you're only going to need a humidity range of around 30 to 40% humidity, which is obviously a lot less than a Crested Gecko. Now, what this basically means is with a Leopard Gecko, you won't have to mist down their enclosure. However, with the Crested Gecko, you're going to need to mist down their enclosure at least once a day. Now, obviously, by misting down the enclosure, this is going to basically provide your Crested Gecko with higher humidity because it's going to boost the humidity within the enclosure. And this is how you're going to be able to achieve a humidity range of around 50 to 80% humidity. But like I say, with a Leopard Gecko, you don't have to do this. So this is definitely one major difference is obviously with the Crested Gecko, you're going to have to mist down their enclosure, whereas a Leopard Gecko, you won't have to. Okay, so now let's move on to talk about the next thing, which is going to be regarding their enclosure setup. Now, this is also one major difference between the Crested Gecko and the Leopard Gecko. Now, Crested Geckos are an arboreal species. Now, what this means is they need more height to their enclosure rather than length to the enclosure. So for a Crested Gecko, what I like to recommend is a 45 by 45 by 60 centimeter high terrarium. And this is going to be perfect for your Crested Gecko to live its whole life in. Obviously, if you want to go bigger, then great. Obviously, this is going to be perfectly fine. You can do so. But as a minimum requirement, I would highly recommend a 45 by 45 by 60 high terrarium. Now, with the Leopard Gecko though, Leopard Geckos are a terrestrial species, which means that they prefer the length rather than the height to their enclosure. So for a Leopard Gecko, what I like to recommend to people is provide them a vivarium, which is a wooden enclosure. Now, the reason why I recommend a wooden enclosure or a wooden vivarium over a terrarium is because the wooden vivarium will retain a lot more heat than a terrarium. So for a Leopard Gecko, what I like to recommend is a 3 foot length by 1.5 foot deep by 1.5 foot high vivarium. Now, again, this is a minimum requirement for an adult. Obviously, if you want to go bigger, happy days, that's great. A lot of my customers are going for the 4x2 enclosures for their pet Leopard Geckos. Like I say, if you want a minimum requirement, a 3 by 1.5 foot enclosure is going to be perfectly fine. So now you might be wondering, well, why does a Crested Gecko use a terrarium rather than a vivarium. Now, the reason why that we use a terrarium for a crested gecko over a vivarium is obviously because, like we just mentioned, with the vivarium, it retains heat a lot better. However, with a terrarium, what this basically does a lot more efficient and a lot more better with is holding and retaining humidity for a longer period of time. And this is the main reason why we use a terrarium for a crested gecko over something like a vivarium, because the vivarium is going to help keep that environment a lot drier and a lot hotter, whereas the terrarium is going to help provide that higher level of humidity for a longer duration. So that is the main differences between both the vivarium and the terrarium, and you now know which enclosure you're likely going to need for both the different species. So obviously you can tell that both these enclosures are slightly different. Obviously the crested gecko enclosure, you're going to need more height to it, and the leopard gecko, you're going to need more length or width to it. So this could have an impact on your choice because you might not have a lot of space available lengthwise, thus meaning that you might find that the terrarium is a better option for where you live. A lot of customers go for a crested gecko over a leopard gecko when they're living in a small apartment or a small flat, just to save on that extra bit of space. But this is definitely something worth keeping in mind. Now, whichever species you decide to go for, whether that's a leopard gecko or the crested gecko, each of these geckos, you're going to want to make sure that you really fill out their enclosure. You really want lots going on inside the enclosure. You want lots of hiding spaces, lots of foliage for them to move between and hide behind. But also, obviously, with a crested gecko, they're going to also want to be able to jump between the vines. Now, that's also another major difference. The leopard gecko is more a ground-dwelling species. This meaning that they're basically going to spend a lot more time on the ground, whereas a crested gecko, they're going to spend more time up high, and also the crested gecko will jump. So you'll likely find that they'll jump from one branch to another. The leopard geckos, they don't really jump, to be fair. I mean, I've probably seen a leopard gecko jump like a few times, but it's nothing like a crested gecko. Leopard geckos do climb though, don't get me wrong, they will climb, especially if you do add loads of branches into their enclosure. I quite often see my leopard geckos climbing, but obviously this is also something to keep in mind, especially if you go for a younger crested gecko, because younger crested geckos tend to be a lot more jumpy than an adult crested gecko. But if you don't really want a gecko that's going to be quite jumpy, then maybe a leopard gecko might be a bit more of a better option for you, because it's going to be less likely that your leopard gecko is going to start jumping. And like I say, they mainly are a ground dwelling species and they tend to just crawl across the ground. Now this here is my adult female crested gecko. This is Kira. She's a beautiful crested gecko, and honestly she is tame as you like. I can pick her up, do whatever I want with her. She really doesn't care. We've got a really good bond together. If I'm completely honest, she doesn't really jump anymore. I do find the older they get, the more sort of tamed out they become, and also the less they jump. I've also noticed that males tend to jump a lot more than females do. Not so much when they're younger. When they are younger geckos, they tend to jump no matter what sex they are. But as you can see, Kira's just chilling on my hand here. She's not really fussed. Like I say, she's very tame. Like I said, I've had her for about 7 years now. I've handled her so much that she's so used to me now. But like I say, if you are concerned about handling a crested gecko and worrying about them jumping away from you, obviously there's things that you can do to manage this. For example, you can hold them over a bed or something, so if they do jump away, they can land on the bed or something. But also with crested geckos, when they jump, you can kind of tell when they're going to do it. What they tend to do is basically they'll use their back legs as almost like springs. So you'll watch them sort of hench their back legs up and then they'll leap forwards. And that's usually a good indicator that the gecko's about to jump. With a bit of experience, honestly, you get the hang of it really easily. And like I say, you do pick up on when they're going to do it. But if you are a beginner, obviously this could be quite daunting, especially like when you want to handle your gecko and you don't want it to run off from you. But this doesn't mean that you won't have a problem with a leopard gecko. Leopard geckos, when they are being handled, they tend to move quite a bit and they will crawl up your arm a fair amount. But yeah, that's also a major difference. Obviously the crested gecko, do be mindful that they do jump. Now another difference between the leopard gecko and also the crested gecko is, first of all, leopard geckos are crepuscular. Now this basically means that leopard geckos are mainly active during dusk and dawn, but they are also active throughout the nighttime, not so much during the daytime. Now with the crested gecko, Crested geckos are nocturnal, which means that they're primarily active throughout the entire nighttime, and then they sleep during the daytime. So they are somewhat similar. You won't really see either of them throughout the daytime. Don't get me wrong, both the crested gecko and the leopard gecko will come out during the daytime from time to time, but it's just not as likely. You might also catch your crested gecko sleeping in the open, and also your leopard gecko sleeping in the open. So there are chances that you will see them both during the daytime, but this is definitely something worth keeping in mind, especially if you're looking for a reptile that's more active during the daytime. If you are looking for a reptile that's more active during the daytime, then maybe the leopard gecko and the crested gecko might not be the best option for you. You might want to look into something like a Rankin's dragon or a bearded dragon, or something on those lines, which are diurnal rather than nocturnal or crepuscular. So like I say, this is another difference between the two species. Like I say, very similar but slightly different. Now the next major difference that usually is the turning point for people is regarding their diet. So leopard geckos are insectivores. This means that you will need to feed them live insect prey for their staple diet. Now this is usually in the form of locusts, crickets, mealworms, and then you can also feed things like waxworms as a treat. And like I say, they are insectivores, so they do need to be live prey. So this is usually what turns people away, because not everyone really wants to feed insects to animals. So that might be something that might make you reconsider the leopard gecko. Crested gecko's main diet is going to be a commercially prepared gecko diet. Now what you do with this diet is you simply mix it with water. And once you mix it with water, what it does is it basically looks something like a McDonald's milkshake consistency. It will just be like a paste, and all you do is you mix it into a little feeding bowl, just like one of these, and simply place it into their enclosure. Now don't get me wrong, the fruit mix, they are 80% of their diet. The other 20% is things like live food. I've had customers that have kept geckos for years and years and have never fed insects. I don't personally recommend this, because it's always good to have a good diverse diet, and it's always good to provide variety. And also on top of that, obviously live insects is going to allow your crested gecko to hunt, and it's going to be a good bit of enrichment for them. But obviously this is a lot more manageable for people. So the next thing that I would like to discuss is regarding cleaning and also their smell. Now both geckos are low odor. However, if you don't clean their enclosure for a long period of time, then you will start to notice a slight smell. More so with leopard geckos I've noticed than the crested gecko, but both will smell if you don't clean regularly. Now I do find leopard geckos enclosures are a little bit easier to clean. Now the reason being is leopard geckos, they tend to choose a specific corner in their enclosure to go to the toilet. This means that every time that you decide you want to clean out their enclosure, you're likely going to know exactly where to find their poo, because it's always going to be in the same place. Whereas with a crested gecko, well, they tend to just poop anywhere, to be honest with you. Sometimes you'll find a bit on the substrate, and sometimes you'll find it on a leaf, sometimes on the glass. There's no like specific place that crested geckos go to the toilet, so this is definitely something to keep in mind. However, both are easy to clean. What I tend to recommend to people is to do regular spot cleans, and what I mean by this is basically inspect the enclosure for any poop and just simply clean up any poop every few days as and when you see it. And then what I recommend to people is to do a deep clean once a month. This is where I remove all of the items, give them all a good rinse off, give them a disinfect, and then put them back into the enclosure. If you do both the spot cleaning and the deep cleaning, then like I say, both won't really smell. You won't notice any sort of bad odors. Other than that, the only other cleaning maintenance that is involved with both the crested gecko and the leopard gecko is obviously cleaning the glass. Now obviously the crested gecko has a lot more glass to the enclosure than the leopard gecko, so it will take a little bit longer to clean a crested gecko enclosure. Now another difference between the leopard gecko and crested gecko is their size and weight. Now they are very similar in size and weight. Leopard geckos tend to grow a little bit larger than crested geckos, Usually leopard geckos get to a range of around 7 to 10 inches long and around 50 to 80 grams. Whereas crested geckos usually average at around 6 to 8 inches and they tend to max out at around 50 to 60 grams. Now their lifespan is virtually the exact same for both of them. They both live for around 15 to 20 years in captivity. And both species of geckos come in a variety of different morphs or colours and patterns, should we say. Now since we're on the topic of how geckos look, I will mention that crested geckos tend to be a lot more softer, almost silky feeling, whereas leopard geckos tend to be a little bit more rougher. Now, crested geckos have what people call sticky toe pads, which is basically tiny little hooks or tiny little hairs that help them stick to surfaces, which is why you'll notice a crested gecko walking across glass, whereas leopard geckos don't have this. They have basically tiny little claws. They're not really sharp, to be honest with you, but this is obviously a major difference. Now on top of that, both geckos can drop their tails. Now crested geckos, once they drop their tail, this is permanent and it won't grow back. They tend to grow just a tiny little stub, whereas leopard geckos, if they drop their tail, they will regenerate their tail, but it won't ever look the same or also feel the same. So definitely something to keep in mind there. So this is the main differences between the two geckos. Let us know in the comments which gecko is right for you, because I'd be interested to know. Both geckos honestly make really good pets. They both are domesticated geckos. And honestly, it really comes down to A, how much space you have available, and B, which diet you're prepared to do. Like I say, if bugs are something that you really don't want to deal with, then maybe a crested gecko is the better option for you. It really does come down to your specific circumstance. And also some of us really don't have a lot of space available, so you know, a crested gecko with a taller enclosure might be a lot more better for you. Either way, both make awesome pets, and both species of geckos always have their own unique personalities. And in all honesty, whichever gecko you choose, you are going to be able to bond greatly with it, and you will have a great experience keeping a pet reptile. So like I say, let us know in the comments which gecko you are more leaning towards. If this video was helpful to you, make sure to drop us a like to let me know that you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And yeah, I hope that video has helped you, and I hope that you have a bit more of an understanding on which gecko you should go for. And I hope that you've learned something from this video. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching, and I shall see you in my next video. See ya!